Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning. Nice to see you again. Glad that you're here. If you're able to come off of, if you're able to turn on your video, please do that. As leaders, hi Jessica, it's good to see you. As leaders, it's important for us to learn how to develop relationships with those we work with, because leadership is primarily a relationship endeavor. And one way to build relationship is through being able to see each other. So that's why I ask people to turn on your video whenever possible. Secondly, because I like to see you while we're doing this. So we're going to pick up on last week's conversation. I wanted to start off by asking you if you had a chance to do that quiz that I talked about with your team around goals. Remember we were talking about goals last week? Remember we were talking about goals last week, and I said there's a simple test that you can do to see whether your teammates are really in alignment with you on what your goals are. And that is, at your next meeting, simply ask everyone one simple question. The question is, please list our current team's goals in priority order. And give everybody a minute just to write down on a piece of paper what they think the current team goals are in priority order, and see what you get. And my experience, having done this with hundreds or maybe thousands of teams by now, is that we almost never really actually have true alignment. We think everybody understands what our priorities are, but really people's understanding is very often different from what we expect it is. So I'm just curious, did anybody do that with your team over the last week? If so, come off mute and I want to ask you about it. Okay, then I'm going to suggest that those of you who are on today do that with your team. It's one simple question. Next time you gather, it's best to do it in person, but if you have a Zoom meeting or something like that, that's perfectly okay. You could even actually do it with one or two people at a time. But I like to suggest that you do it with your whole team, because when everybody shares what they think the priorities are on the team, everybody realizes that, it's all over the place. And that's an important learning for a team, to realize that we all are looking at the same business and we think we're looking at the same way, but it's really not. We really find out that people are not as aligned as we think. Do you remember what our definition was of alignment was? Talked about that last week. I'll pull it up here in just a minute. Alignment means being in clear and explicit agreement. Clear means it's specific and nuanced. Explicit means we've talked it through, or better yet, we've written it down in black and white, so we're not dealing with assumption, guesswork, or speculation. And agreement means that people say, yes, I choose to participate as a member of this team along the lines of what we've talked about here. And so being in true alignment is the goal for teams if you want to execute flawlessly. If you want everybody rowing in the same direction, if you want excellent performance, the research clearly shows that the teams that perform at the highest levels over time tend to be highly aligned in those three areas. And so our focus today is about executing your process flawlessly. Now, that's a big topic. There's a lot of pieces that are part of executing any process flawlessly. But one of the most important elements is this idea of alignment. So I'm going to pull up just one or two slides here, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about it. Down there, just a minute. Here we go. Okay, executing your process flawlessly. Now we're going to have to go into an awful lot more stuff about this as we go throughout the year. It's communication stuff and a whole lot of other things that are part of this. But what we want to focus on today is this alignment piece. We were talking last time about goals. We want to talk a little bit about roles as well. So executing your process flawlessly begins with a couple of things. Let me do it this way. One. First, it is the opportunity for all of us is to make sure that we truly are in alignment. And you may think you're in alignment, but that's why I gave you that particular task to consider doing with your team, because I found that leaders overwhelmingly think we're all on the same page when in reality we're not. And if you want to know why we're not achieving everything that we would like to achieve, one particular piece of that, or one reason that might be happening, is because we're not as aligned as we think we are. And so as a leader, you need to strive to make sure that your team is aligned in three important areas: what our goals are, what our roles are, and what our rules of engagement are. Rules of engagement are the agreements we make with each other about how we're going to work together. how we're going to communicate, how we're going to share information, how we're going to make decisions, what's our process, who's going to enter stuff into the CRM, who's going to follow up on action items in Business Tracker, whatever those elements are, they're part of rules of engagement. A high-performing team, the research shows clearly, is a team that tends to be highly aligned. That is, they're in clear and explicit agreement about the goals, about the roles, and about the rules of engagement. And so it starts with goals. And you think it would be easy for a team to be really in good shape as far as the goals are, right? We all know we want to sell more. Maybe we, 1 million GCI, 500,000 GCI, 200,000 GCI. Yeah, it may be clear and simple in your mind, but I'm pretty sure that if you have any goal other than a simple monetary one, it'll be very likely that the people on your team will not voice that the same way if you ask them to write it down. And if you ask them to rank them in priority order, as I suggest, you'll find that actually people have very different ideas about what the top priorities are. And so that's not about finding fault. It's not about judging your team. It's not about they're not listening closely enough to me or whatever. It's about your being clear that your team is not as aligned as you might think it is. So we talked a little bit about goals in the last few sessions. We were talking about setting goals. We were talking about achieving goals. And last time we started talking about roles. So it's goals, roles, rules of engagement. So last time we were talking about roles. And one of the things that we were discussing was the fact that we sometimes find that a person is executing a particular role in a way that's not like we expected. And we think that we need to either reset that person's role, or maybe we need to get a new person in there. And I shared with you that document, the role resetting guide, right? The role resetting document that asks a bunch of questions for you to think about what the role entails, how it is you want to have that person participate on the team, as well as what it is you need to contribute to that person to make that person successful in that role. And that's something that you should do for everyone that's on your team, at least in your own mind. You can use that tool to sketch out for yourself, what is this role really about? What are my expectations for this person? Those questions are designed simply to make sure that you're not overlooking questions that you need to be clear about as the team leader. And that's whether it's a new role that you're trying to think of filling or adding to the team, or to evaluate the roles that you have right now that may not be working as well as you might think. So we want to continue that conversation around roles, because last time I asked you, would it be useful to you if you had some kind of a dialogue or a script that you could use to have a conversation with a team member when you decided that you need to shift that person's role or re-clarify that role or realign on what that role is all about? Do you remember we talked about that towards the end of the session last time? So I brought with me today a role resetting conversation guide, and I want to share it with you. This resetting guide is a simple dialogue that you can have with anyone. The actual details of the conversation obviously will vary depending on your situation, but the 5 elements of the conversation provide a simple framework for you to follow and adapt to your particular needs. So I'd like to share that with you. First, I want to just ask for anyone who's on the call today, especially Jessica, since she hasn't been here. I'm glad to see her again. I'm wondering, what's a challenge that you're currently having around roles on the team, if any, Jessica?
One of them is letting go of things. So when I delegate something and it doesn't come back correct, maybe 3 times, of course, I'm evaluating how clear I am in presenting the request. But there are some times when, so I'm speaking specifically of somebody who worked with us for 2 weeks, and there was about a 3-month lead up to that 2-week commitment. But then I realized that, for one, she was just there for the money and wasn't really showing up in the way that she promised she would, but always trying to take extreme responsibility for this. I mean, I'm the one who's supposedly communicating this. Anyway, it's hard for me to map something out and let it go without checking it.
Yep, got it. Thank you. So that's a pretty common challenge. I hear it from a lot of team leaders of all Compass agents that I deal with that are team leaders. I hear that a lot. And, it's the business is your baby. It's your business. You want to make sure that it succeeds. You're a caring person. You want to do everything you can to make the business succeed. That's wonderful. It's good. At the same time, sometimes that desire to do everything right may mask a challenge that we have around control. that we might have a fearful interpretation of what would go wrong if we let loose the reins even an inch or 2 inches. And sometimes that concern is justified. Absolutely. It's true that other people may not have the experience that you have, and they may not have the knowledge you have. They may not have the commitment you have. On the other hand, they might. And so as a leader, it's important to make sure that we're asking ourselves, is this really about managing the business well, or is this really about my fear about letting go of, some level of control? And many people will say to me two things that are contradictory. One is, I want to grow my business. The second is, I don't want to let go of anything. Right. And it's a very common dilemma that we find ourselves in. And, if you really do want to grow your business, then eventually you have to let go of something. Absolutely. People talk about scaling the business and 10xing the business. Great. What that generally means is you need more people. And if that is the case, then you become a smaller and smaller percentage of everything that happens. Imagine Robert Refkin. He probably had a lot of thoughts about what he had to hold on to when the business only had 5,000 agents. But it's a different world when it has 15,000 agents, and it's a different world again when it has 25,000 agents, right? We have to let certain things go. So, it's always going to be a tough decision whether to open up a little bit and pass something off to somebody or to hold on to it. Another way kind of around that is to make sure that we're developing people so that they're poised and ready and capable of handling something that we would like to hand off. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. We're going to get into some delegation and some other things later in the process in the year. So I'm glad you brought that up, Jessica. So let me share with you this conversation guide. I'll take you through it step by step, and then we'll talk about a couple of situations where you might apply this. All right. I'd like to hear from you about, what's a situation that you're facing. I mean, the one that you just shared, Jessica, is perfectly appropriate for what we're talking about here. You've worked with somebody, this is that 2-week period, you notice that it's not working exactly like you might want it to, and maybe you'd like to address the situation. Well, one way to do it is to use this conversation guide as a framework for you to have a conversation. I promise you this is something that anybody can do. I promise you that if you're a little uncomfortable or nervous about having difficult conversations sometimes with somebody who's not performing as you might like, and you'd like to address the issue, but you don't want to be confrontational, you don't want to cause some kind of conflict or something, that's all perfectly natural. This particular process is 5 steps. I've given you some kind of language in there that you can either use as is or adapt to your own needs. And following this process has been really successful for a whole number of team leaders to address things like this. So let me pull it up. We'll take a look. Okay, resetting a team member's role. It's important to recognize that having a successful conversation about resetting someone's role has 3 parts to it, or 3 periods to it: the before the conversation, in the conversation, and after the conversation. Many of us would like to just go into a conversation, say 1 or 2 magic words, and the person just magically switches to becoming the perfect employee. And it sure would be great if that would happen, but of course, that's about as likely as happening as your husband or your wife becoming the perfect spouse, right? If you've ever tried to make your husband or wife the perfect spouse, and you'd like the perfect words that you could say, and he or she would just magically become perfect for the rest of your life, that would be great. If you ever figure that out, let me know. Because we're talking about human beings here. And so there are a million shades of black and white. So having a thought that, or having the understanding that there's some before work and some during, and then there's some after work, helps you move through the process successfully. And it starts with being clear about what it is that is acceptable and appropriate for you that the person's doing, and what it is that isn't. So you can use the tool that we gave you last week if that helps you think through what it is you want the person to be doing and how it is you want him or her to be doing it. Or you can just spend time reflecting on, of all the things that I expect this person to do, and you could certainly write them all down and make a list. And you could score each one of them. You could say, action A, better than my expectations. Action B, meeting my expectations. Action C, not meeting expectations, right? Simple, above, meeting, or below. And then the ones that are below, of course, are the ones you want to talk about. So it's very important for you to be clear ahead of time about what those items are, because you can't come into this conversation without, having that clear understanding of what it is that's most important for that person to shift for you. So if you do something like this, then you start with an invitation. Most people would just say, all right, I want to talk with you about X. And so we're launching into a conversation that we've been thinking about for a week, 2 weeks, a month, 2 months. and we're like dropping a bomb on that person. It's like, hey, we need to talk. And some people might be okay to hop into a conversation like that quickly, but some may not. Some may have sensed that you haven't been 100% happy with them lately, and they're a little nervous and a little uncomfortable about that. And when you say, okay, hey, we need to talk, then immediately the wall goes up. So the way that we get around that is by having an invitation before the conversation. An invitation is just that. It's an invitation to the person to say you'd like to talk about something, and would the other person be willing to talk with you about it? And if the person says no, you don't force it on them. You may have to decide at that point that the person might not be right for your team, but you want to give a person a heads up. And so that's the first step in this process, is the invitation. And it could be something simple like, Susan, I'd like to talk with you about your role going forward so we can both be clear about what it is and how we can work together to make it a win-win for you and the team. Would you be willing to have that conversation with me? It's a simple conversation. The first sentence is the why part. The second question is the what part, right? You're saying, would you be willing to have a conversation with me because I want to make sure that we can have a role for you that's a win-win for you and for the team. A very simple statement that lets the person know that something's on your mind, and you're not there to judge them. You're not saying, I'd like to have a conversation with you where I point out all of your weaknesses and fallacies. What I want to do is have a conversation so that we can figure out how to make things a win-win for you and the team. And with that kind of an invitation, 99% of the time, the person would say, yeah, sure. Sometimes they might be happy to have the conversation. Other times they might be a little reluctant. Other times they're not sure why the conversation is necessary, and they may ask you that at that point or later on. But the point is, you're setting up the conversation ahead of time by giving the person an awareness that you want to have the conversation and why it's important to you. You want that person to succeed, and you want the team to succeed. You want a true win-win. That's step one. Step two is where the conversation begins. So you did the invitation 3 days ago, 5 days ago, a week ago, whatever it is. The person agreed to meet you. And so now you get together and you say, hey, thank you, Susan. I'm so glad to be able to take this time to talk about how we can make sure that this is going to be a win for you and for the team. And then you launch into the second stage here, which is getting your team members' perspective. It's very important for you to allow the other person to have a say in this conversation. It's not simply about, I'm going to call you right and wrong on everything, and you just have to accept it no matter what. It's let's be in a dialogue, right? By throwing it to the other person right in the beginning of the conversation, you're saying, I want your input. I value your input. It's important to me to hear what you think about your job. And so you can have questions like this. You start with a sentence like, it's important to me to understand how things look from your perspective, so I have a list of questions I'd like to explore. Now, these are questions that you should consider before the conversation. That's another kind of before piece of homework for you, is to think about which of these conversations might be useful to you, and which of these questions might be useful to you, and which other ones might be useful as well. But there's a whole bunch of them that are useful here, and I'll read them for the folks who are in the car. For example, what do you see as your primary responsibilities at this point? That's great for you to understand where that person is, because I'm pretty sure that he or she is going to have some kind of a gap in there compared to what it is you think the responsibilities are. Second, what is it that you really like about your role right now, and why? This is where you want to understand what it is that's motivating or driving the person to do well, what it is they like about the role, because this conversation is not just about what you don't like about what they're doing. It's to try to understand the whole totality of the role and figure out how you might need to shift some things so it truly is a win-win. 3, what don't you like so much about your role right now, and why? That's a really valuable question to ask. If you never ask that question, you're missing an opportunity to understand what the world looks like from your staff member's point of view. And I'll point out here for everybody that I make a clear distinction between your external clients and your internal clients. Most people that I hear who run teams, or at least are agents, they see their clients as gods. That I'll do anything for my client. Whatever they ask, I'm going to jump as high as I can. I'm going to reach back as far as I need to, and I'm going to do everything possible that I can. But what about the people who are on your team? Do you actually expend the same amount of effort for them, or is it just you kind of just expect them to do things? So I consider your team members your internal clients. If you're only focused on your external clients, how do you expect that great delivery of service to happen if you're not servicing the ones who are inside, who are helping create that experience for your clients? Next question. Which ones are you doing well with and which ones are you struggling with? In other words, which parts of your work are you finding easy? Which parts of your work are you finding difficult? This is a crucial question for you to understand. It may be that they're struggling with the exact same thing that you're thinking about. And that totally opens the door for a conversation. Or they may be struggling with something else that you didn't even realize. They may be struggling with 3 or 4 things that you didn't realize. And so their whole motivation for the job may be a little bit lower because of some other problems that they're having. How about this question? What am I doing that makes things easier for you? And the next one, what am I doing that makes your job more difficult? You know, Jack Welch was this legendary CEO of General Electric in the 80s and 90s when the stock went like this and everybody made zillions of dollars on GE. And he became kind of a well-known guru, management guru for many different reasons. But one question he often asked his team was, what are 3 things that I do that screw up your life? It's a great question to ask. Just ask your team, what's one thing I do that makes your life tougher? What's one thing that I do that screws up your life? Or in the form of these questions here, what am I doing that makes things easier for you? What am I doing that makes your job more difficult? Now, you don't have to use that wording exactly, but getting that feedback from them could be crucial in how you might choose to move forward. Where am I communicating really clearly with you? Where do you need more clarity from me? That's a surprise for most team leaders. They think that they're communicating clearly all the time. And I'm glad that Jessica was asking herself, was I really being clear enough or not? Because it is your responsibility to make sure that they're getting what it is that you're offering, what it is you're communicating. So these are a whole bunch of questions you can ask. Of course, there's many others, but this is the second phase of the process, is to get an understanding of how the other person sees the role. Step 3, envisioning the new role. Now that you know how the other person sees the role, then you can say something like, okay, great. Now let's think about what your role could look like going forward and why. Now, it may be that you want to stop the conversation after step 2, which is getting their perspective on everything. And you might say, you know what? You've given me a lot to think about. I need to think about this for a few days. Can we continue this conversation on Friday at 10? Chances are they'll say, fine, great. So Friday at 10 comes, you say, hey, Susan, thanks for sitting down with me again. You really gave me a lot to think about the other day. And I'm glad that we can kind of think further now that I've had a chance to think that through. Let's think about what your role could look like going forward and why. And so then you ask some more questions here. What are some things you'd like to consider changing about your role and why? What would you like to keep the same and why? So now you're asking for their prescription to how to solve problems that they may see. What could I do differently that would be more helpful to you? What things do you think you need more clarity on? What else could we consider that would make you more successful? So you could have broken the conversation off after part 2, or you could break it off after part 3 here. Again, you're getting their perspective on how you might work better together going forward. That's step 3. Now, number 4, after you've worked through number 3 and you've decided as a pair what it is that you need to do to change things around. Maybe it's more work hours, maybe it's less work hours, maybe it's a different set of responsibilities, maybe it's some training or something like that that they might need. All those things are things that you've talked through, right? You've figured out, okay, this is what we'd like to see going forward. This is what Susan would like to see. This is what I'd like to see. We've talked it through. We're in alignment on it. We're in clear and explicit agreement about what that looks like going forward. Then we want to make sure that we're really clear. Start with, thanks for sharing all your thoughts about your role. It's really important for us to be on the same page going forward about what you'll be doing and how I can support you to be successful. Based on our previous discussion, I've created this list of responsibilities for each of us. I'd like us to go through it to make sure we're both comfortable with it. Can we do that? So this is where you bring to this part of the conversation a whole set of new expectations for each of you, right? It's not just for her. It's not just for Susan or whoever your team member is. It's how you're going to participate as a member of this pair as well. And you go through those things one by one by one. Check them all off as if it's like checkbox, something like that. Yep, I can do that. Yep, I can do that. Yep, I can do that. We are in explicit agreement. Clear and explicit agreement means we've talked it through, or better yet, it's written down in black and white. This is how we can ensure alignment. Not simply, I'll tell you a bunch of things and I expect you to remember them all and understand them all and go do them all perfectly for the next 6 months without forgetting anything. More like, here are the things that I'm expecting you to do. Here are the things you're expecting me to do. Are we on the same page with this? Yes, great. So the only thing left, step 5, is agreeing how we're going to assess how we're doing going forward. And this is something that's often left out. This is the after part of the conversation. How do we follow up on today's conversation or today's agreement or this new agreement? You can start this part of the conversation with, okay, we're on the same page about how we'll be working together, so it's a win-win for all. Now let's talk about how we can assess how we're doing. Simple questions. How often should we talk about how things are going? How about once a month? Why don't we schedule a 30-minute conversation once a month just so we can check in with each other to see how it's going? How will we measure success for each of the responsibilities? Well, some might be easy to measure, like, getting the CRM organized, for example, or turning around some paperwork within a certain amount of time, or getting a certain number of marketing mailings out over 30 days time or something like that. Some things are fairly easy to measure. Others are maybe little more difficult, but it's worth exploring the ones that you can. What do you think you need from me for us to assess ourselves effectively? Sorry about the extra bullet point in there. It's actually the same sentence from the one above. What do you think you'll need from me for us to assess ourselves effectively? Susan may have an answer for you. And what else do we need to think about to make sure we're successful over the long term? And so that's just an open-ended question, and you have no idea what the other person might bring up, but it could be something that you hadn't considered before. Okay, so 5 steps: invitation, getting the other person's perspective, getting their ideas about how we could shift it, agreeing on the new normal, and then how are we going to assess going forward? So this kind of a process is something that you can adapt to any kind of a situation that you have going forward, as long as you have this general flow of the conversation. So we're going to make this deliverable, this resource available to you on our platform, like all of them, as well as the slide deck after today. So when you have a situation like this, certainly reach out and download a copy of it, pull it out, think it through. It's important for you to spend enough time ahead of time before the conversation to make sure the conversation goes the way that you might like. So Jessica, let me come back to you. What do you think about using a tool like this or a process like this for the situation that you're facing?
Well, I took some screenshots of some of these. So I'm actually going to be doing this with my husband, Ken, who's my partner, and it's just the two of us. So we basically wear all the hats like this, and we're trying so hard to get everything separated so that I can focus on, the income producing stuff. And so we tried to hire somebody. It's that situation. Like Ken, of course, I want to remain on the team. He's my life partner as well. And so I do want to ask these questions and work this out and, just ensure that we can continue on together. Not that we're wanting to not, just in case he's listening. But that with the other one, it was really more of, I was talking with my sales manager about it, and she was basically saying, just, you have to cut the cord on this one. Because I had tried before to not ask these questions the way you posed, which is really so great. It was more toward, my being frustrated with, simple things not being completed well and with a bad attitude about it. And, needing to move through these simple things before we could get on to bigger projects, which would excite her more. And so the letter that I wrote, it was a 3-hour meeting actually, the letter that I wrote to her was to reevaluate our roles, but it was more, I've decided, that things would be better if we redefined, rather than you supporting my business, I support your business. And it went on from there. But after, 3 hours, come to find out that there was really so much more going on. Like her mom left her when she was 12, and I think that's dropped her off at school and never came back to get her. And so there were some issues with that. And it, if I hadn't let her go immediately, and really she was overpaid, so I don't have any worries about that at all. I just needed to make it cut and dry.
Yep, got it.
I was going to be hemorrhaging, and then Ian came, and I would have been obligated to pay her, and she wasn't doing anything anyway. So, well.
Yep, got it. So, this particular conversation we're talking today is not designed for, obviously, when you're about ready to let somebody go, or you really do need to let them go. This is where you really want to reconstitute the relationship. and you want to make sure that both of you are in clear and explicit agreement going forward. So it's a different kind of a conversation, obviously different kind of application. Thanks for pointing both of those out. Jamie, can you come off mute for a minute? You said you're in the middle of a situation with someone right now.
Yes, sorry, I've been driving. I can come off my camera as well. I just got to the office. Yes, I'm in the middle of a lack of performance with somebody I brought on a few months ago.
Mm-hmm.
So I find it I have found it extremely helpful. And I hopped on late because I was stuck on a call too. So I'm glad I made it.
Well, we will post this as soon as we can after the call. We'll try to post everything within 24 hours. Sometimes it's 48, depending on how the back end team is doing stuff. But we'll make this available to everybody. Look through the questions that are there and see if they're really appropriate for your situation or not. Certainly don't use questions that are listed there as, don't use them if they're not appropriate for you.
Right.
And if there are other questions that come to mind for you that you should ask instead, that's where you want to insert them.
Well, I know that my girl is feeling stressed and she knows she's not producing and she knows she's not holding up to her end. So
Mm-hmm.
I love the process of making it very collaborative. I mean, I want her to succeed. So I am getting frustrated though. So, and I'm super busy. So I tend to that's just going to slow me down and help me make her feel like she's in control a little bit. So appreciate it.
Yep, you're welcome. One of the things you'll have to decide is whether you want to move through the whole process in one conversation.
Right.
Or in two. And I know that your busyness will tell you, let's just get it all done now. But it's really important for you to read how she's taking all this and see if she's ready to go to those last couple of steps or not. If she is, absolutely move ahead. If she's not ready, then stop after step 2 or maybe step 3, after you've heard everything from her. And then you can reschedule something for the next day.
Love that. Thank you.
All right. Good luck, everybody. I'd love to hear how this goes for you after you try it. Certainly send me an email at any time, David at Chirag Shah Coaching, and look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.